Hello, I'm Stuart McLean. And we're gathered here today in this magnificent hall to celebrate the career of arguably the greatest Canadian musician of all time, the composer, maestro, and hockey organist, Eddie Kovacs. Well, there it is, his stirring and certainly best-known composition, the piece that captured the hearts of the nation and garnered the attention of the world, Kovacs' unforgettable Concerto for Too Many Men on the Ice. And there's the tune that every Canadian knows as well as they know the words to the national anthem, the piece that earned Kovacs the Prix de Rome, the sonata for the short-handed goal. This, of course, is the famous second movement of the sweeping Power Play Symphony, Hewitt 347. Today, on this day of days, on the occasion of his half-century, and the week he's being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, we celebrate the life and times of Canadian maestro Eddie Kovacs. As every hockey aficionado knows, Eddie Kovacs is the Canadian-born son of two Hungarian refugees. Eddie's mother and father were among the thousands who came to Canada after the Soviet invasion of Hungary. They arrived on a chartered flight in 1957 with a cloth satchel, a battered suitcase, and a little white terrier named Olga. They were heartbroken to leave their homeland. The Kovacs resigned themselves to their fate, however, and were soon determined to fit into their newly adopted country. As is so often the case when hearts are ruled by enthusiasm, they became in many ways more Canadian than many Canadians. They bought snow shovels and toques from Eaton's. They took up snowshoeing. And every Saturday night, they listened to Hockey Night in Canada on an old Viking radio. The Kovacs did well in Canada, and pretty soon they had saved enough money to put a down payment on a little bungalow in the town of Brantford, Ontario. On their first Christmas, they celebrated their acquisition by buying a 12-inch black and white television set. It was on that little television that they saw their first game of hockey ever, Detroit versus Toronto. There was, however, a problem. The reception on their television was so poor that Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs couldn't see the puck. And because they'd never seen a game of hockey before, they didn't know there was a puck. Consequently, neither of them could make any sense whatsoever of Canada's national game. It seemed arbitrary and completely mysterious to them, especially the goals. Neither of them wanted to admit it to the other, and so keen were they to be good Canadians that they continued to watch every Saturday night. At the end of every game, one of them would turn to the other and say, "Last point," which was Hungarian for "that was great." But they'd go to bed baffled. It was their passion for the mysterious game of hockey that would shape the destiny of their young son, Eddie. Eddie was born at an exciting time for the Kovacs. the same week that the first ever Hungarian was to make his debut in the National Hockey League, Jaromir Poskavinski Slakalovic. Born in Szombathely, Poskavinski Slakalovic was called up from the minor leagues to play for the Detroit Red Wings. It was a huge night for Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs, the merging of their old culture with the new. On game night, they were sitting on the couch in front of the television like a pair of Hungarian refugees, which of course is what they were. They had Olga, the dog, beside them, and baby Eddie, barely 3 weeks old, propped between them wearing his homemade Detroit Red Wings jersey. Sadly, the night went horribly wrong. At first, they couldn't even spot their countryman. It was Olga, the dog, who finally figured it out. Poskavinski Slakalovic had shortened his name so it would fit on the back of his jersey. Jaromir Poskavinski Slakalovic had become Jerry Pepper. But that was nothing compared to the horror that ensued at the end of the pregame warm-up. Just as the Zamboni was pulling onto the ice, their fledgling hero made one final and furious lap of the rink, pumping his fist in the air. With his head down and his skates biting, he swooped behind the goal just as the Zamboni driver opened the door of his cab. Poskavinski Slakalovic slammed into the open door and went down as if he'd been shot. The freak accident received lots of sympathetic coverage, but the stories gradually faded away when it became clear Jerry Pepper wasn't going to awake from his coma anytime soon. The O-Pee-Chee Company recalled his rookie card before it was released. All of them accounted for but one. It was this accident, almost comedic in its absurdity, that sealed the course of Eddie's childhood. Eddie's fate became linked to the luckless Hungarian hockey player. Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs both came to the same conclusion. Their Eddie would grow up to be the athlete who would redeem the Hungarian nation. For his first birthday, they bought him a hockey helmet and hockey gloves. Olga got him a jock. Although he was much too young to skate, Eddie's parents made him put his equipment on for an hour every day so he'd get used to it. By the time he was 4, the equipment was so much a part of Eddie's life that he could eat his breakfast cereal with his helmet on. By then, Mrs. Kovacs had figured out hockey was played with a puck. She made her son goulash with meatballs in the shape of hockey pucks. She kept a hockey puck in the kitchen and used it to pound veal for Wiener Schnitzel. The winter Eddie was old enough to go to kindergarten, Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs decided it was time to get him his first pair of skates. They bought them secondhand from the family whose backyard was across the Kovacs' back fence, another family with roots in Eastern Europe, the Gretzkys. It turns out that Eddie's first time on skates was on the most famous skating rink in this country, the rink that Walter Gretzky built in the Gretzky's backyard for his son, Wayne. Of course, it wasn't famous then. Eddie was 5 years old, and as he headed for the rink with his father, he was filled with anticipation. He assumed he'd be able to glide around the ice just like the boy next door, who he'd been watching over the fence for 2 years. But when his father lowered him onto the ice, Eddie could barely walk, although he was quite adept at falling. He got up, and he fell down again. He got up, he took a step, and another, and another. walking with the staccato jerk of a penguin, his arms outstretched like the letter T, his father backing away from him the closer he got, Eddie waving his hands in the air, his arms flapping wildly around and around like propellers on a plane. But the plane wasn't taking off, the plane was heading straight for the ground. And Eddie was squirming on the ice like a motherless baby seal. It was the first great disappointment of Eddie's life. While Eddie lay there, the Gretzky boy looped around and around the rink, making skating look ever so easy. Eddie had no aptitude whatsoever for skating. Instead of the roar of hockey, Eddie heard music in his head. He heard music all the time. Even when he was a boy, music was Eddie's great love. Where it came from is a complete mystery. It didn't come from his parents. His parents only ever owned one record. The album was called Dancing and Dining with Olaf and Eva Sveen. 12 polkas played by Olaf on his portable organ, with 12 of his wife Eva's favorite recipes printed on the jacket instead of liner notes. There's a melody on that record that enchanted Eddie the very first time he heard it. This isn't it. Maestro, I said this isn't it. Thank you. It's more of an enchanting tune that reminds you of the wistful theme from a European film. The sort of haunting melody that brings to mind the one great love you let slip away. The melody line hidden in that polka record pops up in Eddie's work all the time. Critics have speculated on where the theme comes from, but none of them have ever got it right. Largely because the Kovacs owned the only copy of the Sveen family album. Anyway, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. The point is that even when Eddie was young, it was music, not sports, that made him happy. The hockey thing, well, the hockey thing was his parents' idea. Eddie, like a moribund penguin, would stand on the ice of the backyard rink his father made, listening morosely to the sounds from his neighbor's yard. Sometimes the whistles and the drills from the Gretzky side of the fence were completely overwhelming. Eddie and his father would be standing on the rink in their backyard, and a puck would sail over the fence and fall at Mr. Kovacs' feet like a dead crow. He'd sigh, his shoulders would sag, and he would pick it up and throw it back. "Why can't you be more like that boy?" his father would say. Then he would glare at Eddie, and Eddie would remember what he was supposed to be doing, and he'd take another step or two and fall over. On his 9th birthday, Eddie Kovacs finally confronted his parents. "I don't want any more hockey equipment," he said. "I want a violin." Mr. Kovacs was horrified. Eddie wouldn't relent. Mr. Kovacs finally proposed a deal. He would get Eddie his violin, and he could practice it as much as he wanted, as long as he practiced skating for the same number of hours. Eddie agreed, and before long he was playing music and skating. One magical winter, he actually played many games of shinny with his soon-to-be famous neighbor. Well, it wasn't exactly shinny. Eddie would skate around jerkily while Wayne practiced his shot. But Wayne seemed to appreciate the company. He told his mother he liked the way Eddie hummed while he skated. In his heart, Eddie wanted to please his father and become adept on skates and in the game of hockey. But in the push and pull between his head and his heart, as hearts are oft to do, always won. Many an afternoon, Eddie would lace up his skates, intending to go outside and practice with his friend next door, and his father would come home from work and find his son standing in the living room, wearing full hockey equipment, including gloves and helmet, playing his violin. At first, his playing was as bad as his skating. At first, Eddie couldn't do anything. Then he learned the scales. Well, sort of scales. He loved the sound of the music coming right from under his ears. In fact, Eddie loved his violin more than anything. He played it so much, he developed a big red blister under his chin. He begged his parents to let him take music lessons. Music lessons, said Mr. Kovacs. What you need are skating lessons. It was another year before Eddie began his formal music training. He took violin once a week at school, and he loved it. There was a school recital at the end of that year, smack in the middle of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Eddie stood on the wooden stage with the other 7 children in his class. "22 years of school." Well, maybe that's how it sounded in the hall, but that's not how it sounded in Eddie's head. In Eddie's head, it sounded grand and orchestral, full of pomp and flourish. More like this. While Eddie performed for the first time in his life, his mother and father were leaning together like 2 endangered birds. They had their ears pressed to a transistor radio. They were listening to the hockey game. In the middle of the concert, Mrs. Kovacs asked the couple beside her when the show was going to end. She wanted to go home and watch the hockey on television. Eddie was by far the best on stage that night, and he kept getting better and better. But the better he got, the worse he felt. Because the more Eddie Kovacs got into his music, the further and further away he moved from the hockey player his mother and father wanted him to be. When he was a boy, he felt guilty about this. Even as an adult, he has always felt like a failure. His life's always been tinged with this sense of failing. The sense, even when he became world famous and was winning awards for his music, that doing what he was doing was not good enough. But he couldn't change anything. Eddie was born to play music, not hockey. Sometimes late at night, he'd stand by his bedroom window, his violin tucked under his chin, and Eddie would look down on the boy next door as he swooped around and around his backyard rink. Sometimes he'd make up tunes to go with these solitary games of hockey. And sometimes when Wayne would hear him playing, he'd stop and look up and wave. One spring, Eddie came home from school and confronted his father. "I need a better violin," said Eddie. "How much?" said Mr. Kovacs, sighing absent-mindedly as he reached for his wallet. $10,000, said Eddie. The next morning, Mr. Kovacs pulled his son out of music lessons. He went to see Eddie's violin teacher before work. He said, "Stop putting crazy ideas in my son's head. He's a hockey player, not a freak." Trying to win his father's affection, Eddie turned to the only music that Mr. Kovacs seemed to enjoy, the instrument played during hockey games. Eddie began playing the electric organ. It seemed to work. On Saturday nights, Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs would sit on the couch and watch their beloved Detroit Red Wings with their television muted. Eddie played the soundtrack on his brand new second-hand portable organ. Before long, Eddie had become so proficient that he was asked to play his organ at the local arena for the Brantford minor team, the Nodrofsky Steelers. He was at the organ during that magical year that Wayne Gretzky played for the team. Gretzky scored 378 goals in just 85 games that year. It was the last year Eddie and Wayne were friends. The next winter, Wayne moved away to play junior hockey. A few years later, Eddie left Brantford too. By the time he was in university, Eddie's musical talent had propelled him to the top of the hill. He was the replacement organist in the gondola at Maple Leaf Gardens. He wasn't exactly playing hockey, but he was playing in the world of hockey. Although his father was still disappointed in him, Mr. Kovacs sometimes would use his son's pass to slip into the gardens to catch a game. He was there the night Jaromir Poskiewincki-Slakalovich, Jerry Pepper, was scheduled to make his comeback. Pepper had recovered from his coma spontaneously in September of 1972. He came to at the exact moment that Phil Esposito tripped and fell during his introduction before the 5th game of the Russian-Canada Summit Series. The TV was on in Pepper's hospital room, and when Esposito went down, Pepper sat up abruptly and said, "What a schnook." There was Pepper's second chance at the NHL. The night he suited up, Eddie was at the organ. Late in the third period, when the Detroit coach finally tapped Pepper on his shoulder, Eddie, high in the gondola above, began to play the Hungarian national anthem. Pepper looked up in surprise, and then, carried away by the music, leapt onto the ice before the shift change. His skate caught the hinge of the still-closed door, and he toppled head first onto the ice. When the referee saw him lying there, he called a penalty against Detroit for too many men on the ice, not realizing that Pepper was out cold and would remain so for another 7 years. Eddie was so distraught that he stood up and left the gondola, never to return. As he left the gardens, Eddie passed his father on Church Street. Mr. Kovacs glared at his son. "You killed him, you're not my son," he said in his heavily accented English. Distraught and feeling unwanted, Eddie quit university and moved to Hamilton. Still subconsciously wanting to please his father, he took a job in a late-night donut shop owned by hockey great Tim Horton. Father and son didn't talk for 2 years. It was Mr. Kovacs who finally broke the ice. After consulting a full bottle of schnapps, he showed up one night on Eddie's 24th birthday at the Tim Hortons drive-thru. He ordered a chocolate-dipped donut for himself and a large double-double for Olga, who was driving. As Eddie handed him his order, Mr. Kovacs pushed a package through the service window. "Happy birthday," he said. Mr. Kovacs had gone into the attic that very afternoon and opened a rusted steamer trunk. He had pulled out an envelope that was lying underneath a blanket. The envelope contained Jaromir Poskiewiński-Slakalowicz's rookie card, the missing card that the O-Pee-Chee Company had never traced. Mr. Kovacs took the card and he drove to Toronto and sold it at a little shop on King Street. Then he took the money to a violin store run by an Austrian man who was wearing a blue suit and fancy gold-framed glasses. "This is a good one," said the man, laying a violin on a blue cloth on the glass counter. It was a Hungarian violin, made in 1841 in Budapest. It cost $10,000. The new violin was like magic. Eddie quit his job at the donut shop. He moved back to Brantford and began practicing his violin for hours every day. Scales, finger exercises, sight reading. It was just like the old days. He'd stand by his apartment window watching children on the rink across the street, playing to the play, a note for every stride. He improvised soundtracks to long games of shinny. And then, one day, he bought himself a pair of skates, got into his car, and drove down to the river. When he got there, he sat on a park bench beside a bare willow tree and put his skates on. The long, thin branches of the willow waving in the wind, brushing against his face and startling him. He stood on the frozen ice uncertainly, and then he walked stiffly back to the shore and reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his new violin. This is where Eddie Kovacs found his musical voice, gliding along the frozen river, with his long scarf trailing behind him and his violin tucked under his chin, the curving banks of the river calling him on. He continued to follow hockey and wistfully watched the exploits of his boyhood chum. Wayne Gretzky had become everything his parents wanted him to be. Eddie often thought of trying to contact him when he came to town, but he thought Wayne wouldn't remember him. Once he even went to the hotel where Wayne was staying and he watched him get on the team bus, but he watched from a distance, too shy to step forward. He rode his oratorio to a hat trick to celebrate Wayne's first scoring championship. And then, as a Christmas present for his mother and father, he wrote his stirring tribute to the Hungarian hockey player Jerry Pepper, the concerto for Too Many Men on the Ice. Just about everyone knows how Eddie Kovacs' music finally came to the public's attention, how Wayne Gretzky showed up shyly at his apartment one night and asked if Eddie remembered him. He came to ask Eddie if he'd play his violin at the famous old-timers game featuring the Hungarian player Poskiewiński-Slakalowic, who'd woken up from his second coma when the Canadians won the gold medal at the 2002 Olympics at Salt Lake City. Poskiewiński-Slakalowic was by then infamous for being the only player to have never played a shift in an NHL game, but still to have received a penalty. playing with all the players of his era, who of course he'd never played with, was Poskavinsky Slokolovich's second greatest thrill. His greatest thrill was playing that night with his birth name on his sweater. It took 3 rows of lettering that wrapped around to the front of his jersey. He scored a picturesque shorthanded goal that night, assisted by Gretzky. It was the goal that would serve as the inspiration for Eddie's Sonata for a Shorthanded Goal. Poskavinsky Slokolovich was also the inspiration for Eddie Kovacs' masterpiece, Lullaby for a Left Winger, for solo bassoon, strings, and percussion. Today, Eddie Kovacs is living in Budapest, working on a commission from the Hockey Hall of Fame, a requiem for the original 6. He's married to Olga Chernobyl, captain of the Hungarian women's hockey team, who he met at a donut store in Lake Placid, New York. Wayne Gretzky is, well, you know. Olga runs an online betting site out of Atlantic City. After his brilliant old-timers game, Jerry Pepper Poskavinsky Slokolovich decided to retire once and for all. Poskavinsky Slokolovich moved to Buffalo, where he drove the Zamboni for the Buffalo Sabres and was, as everyone knows, tragically killed when the giant scoreboard in the Memorial Auditorium crashed to the ice, killing him and strangely leaving the Zamboni with minimal damage. And what of Mr. and Mrs. Kovacs? They still live in their small house in Brantford, Ontario, next to Walter Gretzky. Mr. Kovacs is finally proud of his son. Last year for Christmas, Mrs. Kovacs gave him a CD collection of Eddie's complete works, which he often puts on when there are no hockey games to watch, and when he's not in the mood for his favorite record, Dancing and Dining with Olaf and Eva Sveen.